My daughter-in-law slept with my husband. A week before we signed the divorce papers, I pretended to know nothing. At the settlement meeting, the lawyer handed me a document that erased almost everything I owned. I simply smiled. What I did next left the entire room silent. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end. And comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the dining room curtains as I arranged the good china on the table. Even now, after 42 years of marriage, I still set the table carefully, because habit survives long after love begins dying. At 68, I had learned that marriages rarely collapse all at once. They decay quietly, slowly, one unanswered question at a time. My husband, Richard, had become a stranger months earlier. Not cruel, not openly cold, just absent, in ways difficult to explain to other people. He stayed longer at the office, started taking business calls outside, smiled at his phone, more than he smiled at me. And every night, he climbed into bed carrying the faint scent of expensive cologne. I never bought him. Still, I told myself what older women are trained to tell themselves. Don't overreact. Don't accuse. Don't embarrass the family. Our son Daniel kept insisting the divorce would stay amicable. Such a strange word. There is nothing amicable about dismantling 42 years of your life, while pretending not to notice your husband emotionally disappearing right in front of you. That Tuesday afternoon, I was preparing lunch because Sage had called unexpectedly, asking if she could stop by. Sage was my daughter-in-law Ember's older sister. Quiet, thoughtful, nothing like Ember, while Ember filled every room she entered. Sage always looked like someone apologizing for taking up space. The doorbell rang exactly at 1 o'clock. When I opened the door, Sage stood there, clutching her purse tightly against her chest. Her makeup looked slightly smudged, like she'd been crying. "Naomi," she said softly, "thank you for seeing me." I led her into the dining room, where cucumber sandwiches and tea waited untouched beneath the afternoon light. She barely sat down before I realized something was terribly wrong. Her hands trembled. She couldn't meet my eyes. "Sage," I asked gently, "what happened?" For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she whispered the sentence that split my entire life in half. "It's about Ember and Richard." I felt my stomach tighten immediately. Not because I understood yet, because some part of me already did. Sage stared down at her folded hands. "They're having an affair." The room became impossibly quiet. I remember hearing the clock above the fireplace ticking, one slow second at a time. I remember the smell of tea growing cold beside us. I remember noticing sunlight reflecting against my wedding ring. Funny, the details your mind clings to while your world collapses. "Are you certain?" I asked calmly. Too calmly. Sage nodded miserably. "I saw them together 3 weeks ago near Richard's office. I confronted Ember afterward." Her voice cracked slightly. She didn't even deny it. Something sharp twisted inside my chest. 42 years. A son. A home. Holidays. Funerals. Grandchildren. And somehow it had all led here. "What exactly did she say?" I asked quietly. Sage hesitated. Then regret filled her face. "She said you were old and predictable," she whispered. She said Richard deserved someone who still made him feel alive. The cruelty of that sentence settled deeper than the affair itself. Old. As if aging beside someone faithfully was something shameful. I turned slowly toward the dining room window overlooking the garden. Richard and I planted decades earlier. The roses were blooming beautifully, red and full beneath the summer sunlight. Everything outside looked peaceful. Inside me, something was breaking apart carefully and silently. She also said. Sage swallowed hard. She said once the divorce papers were finalized, You'd barely get anything. That made me turn back immediately. What? Sage looked horrified hearing the words aloud. Ember said Richard already moved most of the assets around months ago. She said you wouldn't even understand the paperwork. Now that hurt. Richard's style. Not explosive betrayal. Calculated betrayal. My husband had always handled the finances. I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? We built our life together from nothing. When we married, we lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store in Milwaukee. Richard worked 14-hour days, building his accounting firm, while I worked night shifts as a nurse. I sold my mother's jewelry to help cover our first mortgage payment. I skipped vacations for years, so Daniel could attend private school. Every sacrifice I made carried Richard's name attached to it. And now, another woman sat inside my family, wearing my daughter-in-law's smile, while helping dismantle everything I spent my life building. I'm sorry, Sage whispered suddenly. I couldn't keep this from you anymore. I looked at her for a long moment. Poor girl. She looked more devastated than the people actually betraying me. Does Daniel know? I finally asked. No, Sage answered quickly. At least, I don't think so. I nodded slowly. My son worshipped Ember. If he discovered the truth, it would destroy him. But, strangely, in that moment, I realized I could no longer protect everyone else at the expense of myself for decades. I had been the peacekeeper in this family, the woman who softened arguments, absorbed pain, stayed quiet to keep holidays comfortable. Women of my generation were taught endurance, like it was a virtue. Maybe sometimes it is. But sometimes, endurance simply teaches cruel people how far they can push you. What are you going to do? Sage asked nervously. I looked down at my untouched teacup. Steam no longer rose from the surface. Everything cold eventually reveals itself. Nothing, I said calmly. Her eyes widened. Nothing? I'm going to smile, I replied softly. I'm going to act exactly the way they expect me to act. But Naomi, they already think I'm weak. I stood slowly and walked toward the window again. Outside, the roses moved gently in the summer breeze. Richard planted those bushes the year Daniel turned 10. He once told me they'd outlive us both. Funny, how marriages don't always do the same. I spent 42 years learning how Richard thinks, I said quietly. If he believes I suspect nothing, he'll become careless. Sage stared at me silently. I think she expected tears. Screaming, maybe even collapse. Instead, something colder settled inside me. Not revenge, not yet. Awareness. The kind that changes a woman permanently. The next 48 hours felt strangely normal. And somehow, that was the most unsettling part. After Sage left, I expected something dramatic to happen. A confrontation. A confession. Some visible crack in the life I thought I understood. Instead, everything continued exactly as before. Richard still kissed my cheek every morning before leaving for work. Still asked whether we needed groceries. Still complained about traffic on Interstate 94. Like he had every Tuesday for the last 20 years. Betrayal rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Most of the time. It wears ordinary clothes and sits across from you at breakfast, pretending nothing has changed. The morning after Sage's visit, I woke before sunrise and walked downstairs to make coffee. Our house in Evanston always felt different in the early morning hours. Quiet, soft, peaceful, in a way daytime never allowed. Richard was already awake, sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through emails on his phone. He looked up briefly when I entered. Morning. Morning. Simple word. 42 years together. And suddenly, we spoke to each other like polite neighbors. I poured coffee slowly while watching him over the rim of my mug. Had he always avoided eye contact this much? Had his smile always looked so rehearsed? Or was I only seeing clearly now? Because the illusion had finally shattered. You're up early, he said casually. Couldn't sleep. He nodded, without looking concerned. And somehow, that hurt more than anger would have. Once upon a time, Richard noticed everything about me. If I looked tired, he asked why. If I seemed quiet, he wrapped his arms around me in the kitchen until I talked. After Daniel was born, I remember crying one night from exhaustion because the baby hadn't slept in 2 days. Richard drove 20 miles at midnight, searching for the specific vanilla ice cream I liked, because he said no mother should cry without dessert in the freezer. That man would have been devastated over seeing me unhappy. The man sitting across from me now barely looked up from his phone. Grief changes people. But so does deception. Around noon, Ember stopped by unexpectedly. She walked through the front door, wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying a white designer handbag that probably cost more than my first nursing paycheck. "Naomi," she called brightly. I was nearby and thought I'd visit. Nearby. Interesting word, considering she lived nearly 40 minutes away. I hugged her lightly anyway. Her perfume smelled expensive and overwhelming. Behind her polished smile, I searched for signs of guilt. I found none, and somehow, that disturbed me more deeply than tears would have. Some people betray others while drowning in shame. Others betray comfortably. Ember belonged to the second category. "I brought pastries," she announced cheerfully, placing a pink bakery box onto the counter. Richard walked into the kitchen moments later, and instantly, the atmosphere shifted. Subtle, but unmistakable. His posture straightened slightly. Her smile softened differently around him than it ever did around Daniel. And suddenly, every strange moment from the last years replayed itself inside my head with terrifying clarity. The private jokes, the lingering glances, the excuses to stay late after family dinners. God, how had I missed it? "You okay?" Ember asked suddenly. I realized both of them were staring at me. I forced a small smile. "Just tired?" Richard stepped toward the coffee maker. "You've seemed distracted lately." Distracted. Such a strange word, from a man secretly dismantling my life. "I'm fine," I replied calmly. Ember studied me carefully for half a second. Not lovingly, cautiously. As if she was checking whether I knew something. Then her bright smile returned instantly. "We should all have dinner together soon," she said. "It feels like forever since we had proper family time." Family time. I nearly laughed. Instead, I nodded politely, while cutting pastries into neat little pieces nobody really wanted. Women from my generation learn very young how to survive uncomfortable rooms. You smile, you pour coffee, you continue breathing, while your heart quietly collapses inside your chest. Ember stayed nearly an hour, and the entire time, Richard acted strangely alert around her, not romantic. Careful. People hiding affairs rarely behave like movie characters. They behave like coworkers sharing a secret no one else is supposed to notice. Small things gave them away. The way conversations paused when I entered the room. The way Richard immediately checked whether I was listening whenever Ember spoke. The way she touched his arm too naturally while laughing. Tiny details. But once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. After she finally left, Richard returned upstairs to his office. I cleaned the kitchen slowly, in silence. One coffee cup still carried Ember's lipstick stain along the rim. I stared at it for a very long time, before washing it away. That evening, Daniel called. My son sounded exhausted. "You doing okay, Mom?" That question nearly broke me. Because, unlike his wife and father, Daniel still sounded sincere. "I'm all right, sweetheart." "You sure?" I closed my eyes briefly. Daniel had always been gentle, sensitive in ways Richard never fully understood. As a little boy, he used to cry whenever birds hit our windows during storms. Even now, at 38, he still apologized too much. And suddenly, I realized something awful. If Daniel truly didn't know about the affair, day, discovering it would destroy him completely. "How's work?" I asked quietly. He sighed heavily. "Busy. Ember's been pushing me to expand the business again." There it was. Even through the phone, I heard exhaustion underneath his voice. Pressure. Ember always wanted more. Bigger house, better memberships, more investments. Nothing ever satisfied her for long. When Daniel and Ember first married, I blamed social media for some of it. Everyone performing perfect lives online, perfect kitchens, perfect vacations, perfect marriages. But eventually, I realized Ember wasn't chasing happiness. She was chasing status. And people's tastes eventually start viewing human beings as tools. After we hung up, I sat alone in the living room, watching rain slide softly against the windows. Richard remained upstairs for hours. At one point, I heard him laughing quietly during a phone call. A laugh I had not heard directed at me in years. Funny thing about betrayal. The affair itself is painful. But what truly destroys you are the realizations surrounding it. The understanding that, while you were protecting the family, someone else was quietly studying how to replace you inside it. Near midnight, Richard finally came downstairs. He looked surprised finding me awake. "You should get some sleep," he said casually. I looked at him carefully across the dark living room. This man had once held my hand during chemotherapy screenings, because we feared I might have breast cancer. This man cried when his mother died. This man renewed our vows in Napa Valley on our 25th anniversary, because he said one lifetime with me would never feel long enough. And now, he was sleeping with my son's wife. Human beings are terrifying sometimes. Not because they change suddenly, because they can hide who they truly are for years. "I'll come up soon," I said softly. Richard nodded and disappeared upstairs. I remained alone in the dark listening to the rain. Then, for the very first time since Sage's confession, I allowed myself to ask the question I had been avoiding. How long had this been happening behind my back? For the next week, I said nothing. And honestly, that was the hardest part. Not screaming, not confronting them, not asking questions that burned holes through my chest. Every waking hour, silence sounds powerful when people describe it afterward. But in reality, silence is exhausting, especially when you're sharing a home with someone who has shattered your life, while pretending everything remains normal. Richard became strangely attentive during those days, not affectionate, careful, almost as if guilt had sharpened his awareness around me. He brought home flowers on Thursday. Yellow tulips, my favorite. 20 years ago, that gesture would have melted me instantly. Now, I stared at the bouquet, sitting on the kitchen counter, and wondered whether he bought them after leaving Ember's bed. Funny how betrayal poisons, even beautiful things. "You didn't have to do that," I said quietly while trimming the stems. Richard loosened his tie and smiled faintly. "Just felt like it. Felt like it." Such harmless words, and yet I remembered when his words used to feel safe. That night, we attended a fundraising dinner for the Children's Hospital where I volunteered twice a month. Richard almost canceled at the last minute. "Busy, weak," he muttered while adjusting his cufflinks. But appearances mattered deeply to him, especially in Evanston society circles. So, he came anyway. The ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and polished silverware. Women in elegant gowns moved from table to table, discussing charity auctions and vacation homes in Colorado. I wore a navy blue dress Walter's sister once told me made my eyes look younger. Richard barely looked at me all evening. While he spoke with another attorney near the bar, I stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the lake. Cold wind moved across the water. Chicago nights near the lake always smell faintly like rain and concrete. I stood there alone for several minutes, before hearing heels approach behind me. Ember. Of course. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself dramatically. "I needed air too," she said softly. I nodded politely. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. You've seemed distant lately, Naomi. There was something almost amusing about hearing concern from the woman secretly sleeping with my husband. I've been tired, I replied calmly. She leaned against the terrace railing beside me. You should take better care of yourself. That sentence stayed with me afterward. Not because of what she said, because of how she said it. Gentle, controlled. Like speaking to a fragile older woman already halfway removed from the center of her own life. And suddenly, I understood something important about Ember. She didn't see herself as stealing Richard. She saw herself as replacing me. In her mind, I was already fading out naturally. Older women become invisible slowly in this country. People stop asking our opinions, stop noticing our sadness, stop imagining we still deserve passion, or loyalty, or truth. Ember understood that, and she used it beautifully. You know, she continued casually, staring out over the water. Sometimes people stay in marriages too long, simply because they're afraid of change. I turned toward her slowly. The wind lifted strands of her dark hair across her face. She looked young, confident, completely unafraid. Are you speaking generally? I asked. Her lips curved slightly. Just observing. Observing. Interesting choice of word. For one reckless second, I almost confronted her right there on the terrace. I imagined grabbing her arm and demanding the truth, demanding details, demanding explanations for how a woman could smile across holiday tables while betraying her own husband and sleeping with his father. But what would that accomplish? She would deny everything. Richard would protect her. Daniel's life would explode overnight. And worst of all, they would immediately become cautious. No, if people are determined to deceive you, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let them believe you still trust them. Inside the ballroom, applause suddenly erupted for the charity speaker. Ember smiled brightly again.
We should head back in.
As she walked ahead of me toward the ballroom doors, I noticed Richard already watching for her from across the room. Not consciously, not obviously, but intimately. The kind of instinctive attention people only give someone emotionally important to them. And once again, I felt that awful sensation of seeing my entire life rearrange itself into a shape I no longer recognized. Later that night, after we returned home, Richard showered and went straight upstairs to bed. I remained downstairs cleaning non-existent crumbs from the kitchen counters, just to avoid lying beside him. The house felt different now. Not peaceful, occupied, as if strangers had slowly moved into the center of my marriage, while I was still living inside it. Near midnight, I finally walked upstairs. Richard was asleep already, one arm stretched across my side of the bed. For decades, I used to find comfort in that gesture. Tonight, it made my stomach turn. I changed quietly into my nightgown and stood for a moment beside the dresser, staring at our wedding photograph. 1979, Milwaukee Courthouse. I was 26. Richard was 30. We looked so impossibly young, hopeful, poor, honest. Or at least, I had been honest. I touched the edge of the frame gently. Then my eyes drifted downward toward Richard's phone, charging on the nightstand. The screen lit faintly with a new notification. One message. From Ember. My entire body went cold. For several seconds, I simply stared at the glowing screen in the darkness. Then slowly, carefully, I picked up the phone, and what I saw finally destroyed the last piece of denial still living inside me. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen glowing faintly in the dark bedroom. One message. That was all it took. People imagine betrayal arrives with dramatic confessions and slammed doors. But sometimes it arrives as a single line of text at 12:14 in the morning, while your husband sleeps beside you. Richard's phone had never been locked before. We spent 42 years sharing cylinders, calendars, bank accounts, and doctor appointments. I never once felt the need to check his messages. Because trust makes you blind in very ordinary ways. The notification preview remained visible across the screen from Ember. I miss you already. 3 simple words. Underneath them sat a red heart, and suddenly I felt something inside my chest go completely still, not shattered, not explosive, just still, like a lake freezing overnight. Beside me, Richard slept peacefully beneath the navy comforter we bought together during a winter trip to Vermont nearly 15 years earlier. I remembered laughing with him inside that little furniture store while snow fell outside the windows. We argued for 20 minutes over colors because Richard insisted navy looked more elegant than gray. Funny how memories continue existing, even after trust dies. Slowly, carefully, I unlocked the phone. My fingers felt ice cold. The message thread opened instantly, and suddenly, every suspicion became unbearable reality. Photos, private jokes, hotel reservations, messages stretching back almost 11 months. 11 months. Nearly a year of family dinners, birthdays, Sunday visits, Christmas morning, all while they carried this secret quietly behind Daniel's back. Behind mine, I sat motionless on the edge of the bed, scrolling through conversations that destroyed my understanding of my own family. Piece by piece. At first the messages sounded playful. Flirtation disguised as emotional intimacy. Complaints about stress. Jokes about feeling misunderstood. Then gradually, the tone changed. More personal, more reckless. One message from Richard made my stomach twist painfully. You make me feel young again. Young. As if loyalty somehow grows less valuable with age. Another message from Ember read, she notices less than you think. I had to press my hand against my mouth, just to stop myself from making a sound. Notices less. There it was. The thing older women quietly fear, but rarely say aloud. That eventually, people stop seeing us clearly. Stop believing we are emotionally sharp enough to recognize deception. Invisible women become easy women to betray. My eyes burned as I continued reading. Richard complained constantly about our marriage, about routines, about aging, about me. She still lives like we're 30 years old. I can't breathe in that house anymore. And then, the sentence that hurt worst of all. She stopped feeling like a wife years ago. I stared at those words, until they blurred. 42 years. And somehow, my entire existence had been reduced to an inconvenience he discussed privately with my son's wife. I should have cried. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Because sometimes pain becomes too large for immediate tears. Around 1 o'clock, I finally set the phone back onto the charger, exactly where I found it. Richard shifted slightly in his sleep. For one horrifying second, his arm brushed against mine gently, instinctively, familiar, like the husband I used to know. I stepped away from the bed immediately. Then I walked downstairs into the dark kitchen and sat alone at the table until sunrise. The house sounded different at night. Floorboards creaked softly. The refrigerator hummed. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. I used to find comfort in those sounds. Now, they felt unbearable. Around 6 in the morning, Richard came downstairs wearing gray sweatpants and looking half asleep. He stopped when he saw me sitting there. You're awake early. I wrapped both hands around my untouched coffee mug. Couldn't sleep? He walked toward the coffee maker casually. And for a moment, I simply watched him. This man knew exactly what he had done. Yet his voice remained calm, his movements ordinary. Human beings are frighteningly skilled at compartmentalizing guilt. How's Daniel? I asked suddenly. Richard paused only briefly. Busy with work, I think. I nodded slowly, busy, while his wife slept with his father. God, the cruelty of it almost felt unreal. Richard finally glanced toward me. You okay? Such a careless question. as if emotional devastation announces itself visibly after midnight. "I'm fine," I answered softly. And strangely, part of me realized it was true. Not because I wasn't hurt, because something inside me had shifted permanently overnight. The confusion was gone now. So was denial. Truth may destroy peace, but at least it ends uncertainty. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. The moment I opened the door and saw my son standing there holding grocery bags, my chest tightened painfully. He smiled tiredly. "Thought I'd bring dinner ingredients." Daniel always did that after stressful work weeks. Cooking relaxed him. When he was little, he used to stand beside me on a chair stirring pancake batter every Saturday morning, while Richard read newspapers at the kitchen table. Some memories remain so tender. They survive even betrayal. "You didn't have to do that," I said quietly. He kissed my cheek. "You've seemed lonely lately." Lonely. I nearly broke apart hearing that word. Because unlike Richard and Ember, Daniel still saw me. Really saw me. We cooked together quietly for nearly an hour. Pasta sauce simmered on the stove while rain drifted softly outside the kitchen windows. And for several minutes, life almost felt normal again. Then Daniel casually reached for Richard's expensive whiskey bottle. "Dad's drinking more lately," he muttered. I kept stirring the sauce carefully. "Have you noticed?" "Yes!" Daniel frowned slightly while opening the bottle. "He's been acting strange for months." My grip tightened around the wooden spoon. "Strange how?" Daniel hesitated, then shrugged uncomfortably. "Distant. Distracted. Ember says it's probably stress." Ember says, "Of course she did." The woman helping destroy his life was also controlling the explanation for it. I looked at my son, standing there in my kitchen, completely unaware that the two people he trusted most were betraying him in the worst possible way. And suddenly, the affair stopped being only about me. Now, it was about Daniel too, protecting him, preparing him, because eventually, this truth would explode through our family, whether I wanted it to or not. And when that happened, my son's entire world would collapse beside mine. After Daniel left that evening, I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the half-empty whiskey glass he'd forgotten beside the sink. Rain still drifted softly against the windows. The house smelled like garlic, tomatoes, and old memories. For years, this kitchen had been the center of our family. Birthday cakes cooling on the counters, Christmas cookies stacked in metal tins, Daniel doing homework while Richard complained about taxes at the table. Normal life leaves traces everywhere. And that's what makes betrayal so disorienting. The rooms stay the same, while the people inside them become strangers. I rinsed Daniel's glass carefully and placed it into the dishwasher. Then I noticed Richard standing quietly in the doorway watching me. "When did Daniel leave?" he asked. "About 20 minutes ago." Richard nodded absently and loosened his tie. Lately, he always looked exhausted around me, not guilty, burdened, as if maintaining two separate lives required more energy than he expected. "He seems stressed," Richard muttered while opening the refrigerator. I leaned lightly against the counter. "He's worried about you." That made Richard pause briefly. "Why would he be worried about me?" I watched him carefully. Even now, after discovering everything, part of me still searched his face, hoping to find regret somewhere underneath all the deception. Instead, I found irritation. "You've been distant lately," I said softly. Richard grabbed a bottle of water without meeting my eyes. "Work's been complicated." Work. Always work. People hiding affairs love ordinary explanations. Because ordinary explanations sound safe. I nodded quietly. Then I asked the question that had been circling my mind for days. "Are you happy, Richard?" He finally looked at me then, really looked at me, and for one strange second, I saw panic flicker across his face. Not because of the question itself, because unhappy people fear honesty. more than accusations. "What kind of question is that?" he asked carefully. "A simple one." He unscrewed the water bottle slowly. "I'm tired, Naomi." There it was again. Not love, not reassurance. Exhaustion. As if our marriage had become something he merely survived. 42 years together. And somehow we had reached a point where emotional honesty sounded dangerous between us. "I used to know what you were thinking before you even spoke," I said quietly. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. People change. Such a cold sentence. Especially coming from someone who once wrote me 6-page love letters while traveling for business. I remembered finding one of those letters tucked inside an old cookbook after Walter died. Richard had written it during a conference in Seattle back in 1994. "Now I miss you. Every second I'm away from you." Funny how the same man could someday struggle to sit through breakfast with me. That night, Richard went upstairs unusually early. I remained downstairs in the living room pretending to read, while my mind replayed every message I saw on his phone. 11 months. Almost a year. I kept returning to that number. An affair lasting weeks feels reckless. An affair lasting nearly a year becomes a parallel relationship. Near 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed unexpectedly. Sage. Her voice sounded nervous immediately. "Naomi, are you alone?" "Yes." A pause, then a shaky breath. "I think Ember suspects I told you something." My stomach tightened instantly. "What happened?" "She asked strange questions today." Sage lowered her voice. "About whether I visited you recently. About whether you've seemed upset." "Interesting." "So Ember was watching me carefully, too." "I didn't say anything," Sage continued quickly. "But she's paranoid lately. Paranoid people usually know they've done something wrong." I moved quietly toward the living room window. Outside, the streetlights reflected across wet pavement. "Has she said anything else?" I asked softly. Another silence. Then Sage spoke so quietly. I almost missed it. "She wants Richard to finalize the divorce soon." The words settled heavily into my chest. Soon. So they already had a timeline. Plans, conversations about my future, happening privately without me. I closed my eyes briefly. "When did she say this?" "Yesterday." Yesterday, while Daniel stood in my kitchen, making pasta sauce. Completely unaware his marriage was rotting underneath him. God. Some betrayals infect entire families before anyone notices. "There's more," Sage whispered. My grip tightened around the phone. "What?" I overheard Ember talking about the house. Every nerve in my body went still. "What about it?" "She thinks Richard should force the sale during the divorce settlement." Sage's voice cracked slightly. "She said you wouldn't be able to maintain it alone, anyway." I looked slowly around my living room. The cream-colored sofa Richard and I bought after Daniel graduated college. The piano near the fireplace where my grandchildren played Christmas songs every December. 42 years of life filled these walls. My husband and daughter-in-law were discussing how quickly they could remove me from it. After we hung up, I sat motionless for a very long time, not crying, just thinking. Women my age become experts at surviving emotional earthquakes quietly. You keep breathing, keep functioning, keep making coffee and folding laundry, while your entire life collapses invisibly around you. Around midnight, I finally walked upstairs. Richard was still awake, sitting in bed scrolling through his phone. Probably her messages. He looked up when I entered. "You were on the phone a while," Sage called. That caught his attention instantly. Small reaction, but noticeable. What did she want? I began brushing my hair slowly in front of the vanity mirror. Just checking on me. Richard watched me carefully through the reflection. Sometimes silence forces guilty people to reveal themselves faster than confrontation ever could. "She's always been dramatic," he muttered eventually. "Interesting. Not kind, not protective, dismissive. People often become irritated with anyone threatening their secrets." I set down the hairbrush gently. Do you ever think about how quickly families fall apart? The question lingered heavily in the room. Richard frowned slightly. Where is this coming from? I turned toward him calmly. No reason. But there was a reason. A very large one. Because, for the first time since discovering the affair, I was beginning to understand something terrifying. This wasn't just passion. This wasn't some late-life emotional crisis. Richard and Ember were building plans together. Plans involving money, the house, the divorce, maybe even life afterward. And suddenly I realized I wasn't simply dealing with betrayal anymore. I was dealing with people already preparing to replace me completely. The following week felt like living inside a house slowly filling with smoke. Nothing looked destroyed yet, but every room carried warning signs. Richard became increasingly distracted around me. Not careless exactly, more impatient, as though he wanted our marriage to end quickly. Now that he had emotionally committed himself elsewhere. One morning, I found him standing alone in Walter's old study, flipping through financial documents. That room used to belong to peace. Walter spent years there balancing accounts, reading newspapers, pretending not to nap in his leather chair after lunch. After Walter died, Richard gradually took over the space whenever he worked from home. Funny how people slowly occupy territory before they openly claim it. What are you looking for? I asked quietly from the doorway. Richard looked up too fast. Nothing important. His hand covered several papers instinctively. My stomach tightened. For 42 years, Richard never hid paperwork from me. Now, even ordinary documents made him defensive. I stepped farther into the room slowly. Morning light filtered across the hardwood floor, while dust drifted lazily near the bookshelves. Everything looked calm, and somehow, that was the frightening part. Affairs don't just destroy trust. They poison normal moments until every interaction feels suspicious. You've been spending a lot of time in here lately, I said casually. Richard shrugged. It's quiet, quiet. Another harmless word, carrying too much meaning. This entire house used to feel quiet with him. Now, silence between us felt crowded somehow. I noticed one document partially exposed beneath his arm.
Property estimates.
For our house. Interesting. Richard followed my eyes immediately and closed the folder. Too quickly. There's a leak near the upstairs bathroom, he muttered suddenly, changing subjects. We should probably get quotes before winter. People hiding larger truths often cling desperately to small practical conversations. I nodded calmly. I'll call someone. I already did. Of course he had. Control. That's what this was becoming now. Control over finances. Control over timelines. Control over the future they were quietly planning without me. That afternoon, I drove to Milwaukee to visit my older sister, Claire. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. Claire lived alone in a small brick house filled with books, plants, and old jazz records. Her husband passed away 7 years earlier. Yet somehow she remained steadier than most married people I knew. She opened the front door, wearing reading glasses, and immediately frowned at my face. What happened? I nearly collapsed hearing those words, not because of the question itself. Because, she noticed, older women recognize suffering in one another quickly. We've survived too much not to. Claire made tea while I sat silently at her kitchen table twisting my wedding ring around my finger. Finally, she looked at me directly. Tell me. And for the first time since Sage's Kitzbah confession, I told someone everything. The affair, the messages, the divorce plans, the house. Claire listened without interrupting once. Only the clock above her stove moved, ticking softly through the silence. When I finally finished speaking, she leaned back slowly in her chair. I always knew that girl was dangerous. Ember. Even hearing her name made my chest tighten now. I kept thinking, maybe I misunderstood things, I whispered. Claire shook her head firmly. No, Naomi. You trusted people who deserved less trust than you gave them. That sentence settled deeply inside me. Women from my generation were raised to preserve families at any cost, forgive quietly, endure gracefully, protect appearances. But nobody teaches older women how to survive betrayal. From the very people they spent their lives protecting. Claire reached across the table and touched my hand gently. What are you going to do? I stared down at my wedding ring. 42 years sitting on my finger, the skin beneath it permanently pale from decades of loyalty. I don't know yet. But even as I said the words, part of me realized that wasn't true anymore. For days, I had reacted emotionally. Now, something colder was beginning to form underneath the grief. Awareness. Strategy. Because Richard and Ember already believed they controlled the situation completely. And that was their first mistake. Claire disappeared upstairs briefly before returning with a thin business card. Call her. I looked down at the name. Margaret Holloway, family attorney. I used her during Harold's estate issues. Claire explained quietly. Smart woman. Doesn't intimidate easily. I slipped the card carefully into my purse. The drive home felt strangely peaceful. Rain clouds stretched across the highway while old Fleetwood Mac songs played softly through the speakers. And for the first time in weeks, my thoughts felt clear. Painfully clear. When I arrived home, just after sunset, Richard was standing in the kitchen checking his watch. You were gone all day. Interesting. Not concern. Irritation. I visited Claire. He nodded once. Then his eyes narrowed slightly. You could have told me. I removed my coat slowly. You stopped telling me things a long time ago. The sentence escaped before I could stop it. Richard froze. So did I. For one dangerous second, the entire room changed. His expression sharpened slightly. Suspicious. Careful. And suddenly, I realized how close I had come to exposing myself too soon. People become unpredictable once they fear losing control. What's that supposed to mean? He asked slowly. I forced a tired smile. Nothing. I'm exhausted. He continued staring at me another moment, then finally looked away. But something shifted after that. I could feel it immediately. The atmosphere inside the house tightened subtly over the next 2 days. Richard started watching me more carefully, as if trying to determine whether I still fit neatly into the version of me he believed existed. The loyal wife, the aging woman too emotionally dependent to suspect betrayal, the predictable Naomi. Meanwhile, Ember suddenly began texting more frequently. Little messages, pretending warmth, checking in, sending photos from restaurants, performing normal family behavior too aggressively. Guilt makes people overact. Thursday evening, Daniel invited us all to dinner at his house. The thought alone made my stomach ache, because I now understood something my son still didn't. He was the only innocent person left inside this disaster. And by the end of that dinner, I would discover something even worse than the affair itself. Daniel's house smelled like rosemary chicken and burnt garlic bread. When we arrived Thursday evening, normal smells, comforting smells, the kind that belong inside ordinary family dinners. And somehow, that almost made everything worse, because nothing about our family felt ordinary anymore. Richard drove in silence the entire way across Evanston. One hand rested loosely on the steering wheel, while jazz music played softly through the speakers. For years, I loved driving with him at night. We used to talk about everything during car rides, vacation plans, retirement dreams, what color to repaint the kitchen. Now, silence stretched between us like another passenger sitting in the back seat. When we pulled into Daniel's driveway, Ember opened the front door before we even reached it. Bright smile, barefoot, glass of wine already in hand. She looked perfectly at home standing there, waiting beside my husband. Not my son, my husband. That realization hit me so suddenly, I almost stopped walking. Naomi! Naomi, she said warmly, stepping forward to hug me, her arms wrapped around me gently, affectionately. The performance would have impressed anyone who didn't know the truth. I hugged her back anyway. Women survive impossible situations by learning how to act through pain. Inside, Daniel stood at the stove stirring sauce while soft music played from a speaker near the kitchen island. "Mom," he smiled tiredly, "you made it." There was something heartbreaking about his face lately. Exhaustion beneath the eyes, tension around the mouth, as if somewhere deep inside, his instincts already sensed the life around him, shifting in dangerous ways. "You need help?" I asked. "Nah, almost done." Richard immediately walked toward the wine rack near the dining room. Ember followed him without thinking. And that was the first thing I noticed. Instinct. People emotionally attached always drift toward one another naturally. Daniel didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he trusted them too completely to imagine betrayal sitting directly in front of him. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Pasta. Chicken. Salad Daniel made himself. Conversation stayed safely shallow at first. Work updates. Weather. A neighbor complaining about property taxes. Normal family dinner topics. But tensions kept surfacing underneath the small talk, like cracks beneath thin ice. Richard barely looked at Daniel. Ember watched Richard constantly when she thought nobody noticed. And every time I spoke, both of them reacted just slightly too carefully, as if monitoring me. Waiting. Halfway through dinner, Daniel stood to refill wine glasses. That's when Ember made the mistake. A small one. Tiny, really. But betrayal often reveals itself through ordinary familiarity. Richard reached automatically for his glass before she handed it to him. Not strange by itself, except Ember laughed softly and said, "Still impatient. Still. Such a dangerous word. Still implies repetition. History. Private patterns already established." Daniel didn't react immediately, but I saw something flicker across his face. Confusion. Very small. Gone almost instantly. Richard noticed it too. The atmosphere shifted subtly after that. People hiding secrets become hyper-aware of tiny mistakes. Ember recovered quickly, smiling brightly. "You always reach too early for wine," she teased. "Too smooth, too practiced." Daniel laughed politely and returned to his seat. But his eyes lingered on them both. 1 second too long, and suddenly, I understood something terrifying. He was beginning to notice. Not the affair itself, not yet, but inconsistencies. Energy. Chemistry people weren't supposed to have. The dinner continued. But nobody relaxed afterward, especially Richard. He started drinking faster, talking louder, overcompensating. People trying to appear normal usually become unnatural instead. Then came the moment that changed everything. Daniel disappeared upstairs briefly to answer a work call. The second he left the room, silence dropped heavily over the table. Ember stared down at her wine glass. Richard loosened his collar, and for one horrifying second, they looked exactly like what they truly were. Not father-in-law and daughter-in-law. A couple. I felt sick. Then Ember spoke quietly without looking at me.
Daniel's under a lot of pressure lately.
Richard nodded immediately. He pushes himself too hard. The intimacy in that exchange made my stomach twist. Shared concern. Shared emotional territory. The kind married people develop over years together. Not in-laws. Married people. I looked toward the staircase. My son remained. Upstairs. Completely unaware that the two people sigled like court partners were betraying him behind his back. God, the cruelty of that nearly broke me. Then Ember made another mistake. "He barely sleeps anymore," she sighed softly. Richard answered without hesitation. He never slept well after stressful meetings. I froze. Because Daniel never told Richard that. He told Ember, privately, during one of their marriage counseling periods nearly 2 years earlier. I knew because Daniel cried while telling me how disconnected his marriage had become back then. Richard should not have known that detail. Not unless Ember shared deeply personal conversations with him. And suddenly, the realization hit me instantly. This affair wasn't only physical. They had built emotional intimacy, on top of Daniel's private pain. I think something showed briefly on my face because Ember suddenly looked at me sharply. "You okay, Naomi?" 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me. I forced a smile so quickly. My cheeks hurt. Just tired. Again tired. Women use exhaustion to hide emotional devastation all the time. Because people accept tiredness more comfortably than truth. A few minutes later, Daniel returned downstairs. And the second he entered the room, Ember and Richard shifted apart emotionally, so fast it became almost visible. Too fast. And this time, Daniel noticed. I saw it clearly. His smile faded slightly while sitting back down. Nobody else spoke for several seconds. Then Daniel looked directly at his father. "You all right, Dad?" Richard blinked. "Of course. You seem nervous tonight." The room went completely still. Ember laughed too quickly. "Nervous?" Richard never gets nervous. But Daniel kept watching him carefully. And for the very first time since discovering the affair, I realized something important. Secrets change the atmosphere around people. Eventually, even innocent people start sensing the distortion. Dinner ended awkwardly after that. Too many forced smiles. Too many rushed goodnights. As Richard grabbed his coat near the front door, Daniel suddenly touched my arm gently. "Mom, can I ask you something?" My heart started pounding immediately. "Of course." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. Has something been going on between Dad and Ember? And in that moment, the world seemed to stop moving around me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Daniel's hand still rested lightly against my arm near the front door, while rain tapped softly against the porch windows behind him. Richard stood only a few feet away, putting on his coat. Ember froze beside the staircase, and suddenly, the entire house felt dangerously fragile, like one wrong sentence could blow apart every remaining piece of our family. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. Daniel hesitated. His eyes moved briefly toward Richard, then toward Ember. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "Something just feels off lately." Nobody spoke. And somehow, the silence itself became an answer. I saw panic flicker across Ember's face before her expression smoothed instantly back into concern. "You're stressed, honey," she said gently, stepping closer toward him. "You've barely slept this month." Again. Redirecting. Controlling the narrative before questions could fully form. Richard cleared his throat awkwardly. "Your mother's right. Work pressure can make people imagine things. Your mother, not Naomi, not she, your mother. Funny how people cling to formal distance when emotional situations become dangerous." Daniel looked unconvinced. Not suspicious exactly, but unsettled. The kind of quiet instinct people feel before discovering truths they are not emotionally prepared to survive. I forced myself to smile calmly. "We're all tired," I said softly. "That's all." The moment passed. Barely. Daniel nodded slowly, though uncertainty still lingered in his eyes. Then Ember wrapped her arms around him and kissed his cheek with almost theatrical affection. Watching her touch my son after reading those messages on Richard's phone made something inside me ache physically. Cruel people don't separate lies from tenderness. They perform both simultaneously. The drive home felt unbearable. Richard kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, while streetlights slid across the windshield in long yellow streaks. Neither of us spoke for nearly 15 minutes. Then finally, he exhaled sharply. That was strange. I stared out the passenger window. "What was?" "Daniel." Richard adjusted his grip on the wheel. "He's acting paranoid lately." Paranoid. Interesting word, coming from a man secretly sleeping with his son's wife. "He seems unhappy," I replied quietly. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. Marriage is difficult sometimes. I turned slowly toward him, and for one dangerous second, I almost asked which marriage he meant. Instead, I stayed silent. Silence had become my armor now. At home, Richard poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey immediately after taking off his coat. He looked exhausted, not emotionally devastated, not ashamed, just tired from maintaining deception. I sat quietly on the living room sofa, while he stood near the fireplace sipping his drink. The distance between us felt enormous, despite sharing the same room. Finally, Richard spoke again. "You've been very quiet lately." I looked down at my folded hands. "Have I?" "Yes." His tone carried caution underneath it now, suspicion growing slowly. Richard was beginning to realize I no longer reacted predictably around him. And unpredictable people frighten liars. "You seem different," he continued carefully. Different. He noticed it too. The old Naomi would have chased emotional reassurance by now, asked questions, sought closeness. Instead, I was observing him, watching, learning. "I think people change after disappointment," I said softly. Richard stared at me for several long seconds, then finally looked away first. Guilt struggles under sustained eye contact. That night, I waited until he fell asleep before walking quietly downstairs with my phone. At 1:17 in the morning, I called Margaret Holloway, Claire's attorney. She answered surprisingly quickly for someone her age. "Mrs. Holloway speaking." "My name is Naomi Bennett," I whispered quietly from the kitchen. "My sister Claire gave me your number." A pause. Then calm professionalism. "How can I help you, Naomi?" I closed my eyes briefly, because somehow, saying the words aloud made everything more real. "I believe my husband is having an affair with my daughter-in-law." Silence. Not shocked silence, measured silence. The kind belonging to someone who has spent decades hearing ugly truths about families. "I see," Margaret said carefully. Tears finally burned behind my eyes for the first time since Sage's confession. Not because of the affair itself anymore, because hearing it loud made it impossible to hide inside denial. Even 1 second longer. There may also financial issues connected to divorce," I added quietly. Margaret's voice sharpened slightly. "Do you have documentation?" "Yes." "Good." That single word steadied me unexpectedly. "Good. Not hopeless. Not impossible. Good." Margaret asked me several practical questions after that. Bank accounts, property ownership, business assets, retirement funds. I answered carefully. While sitting alone in the dark kitchen, where I once packed Daniel's school lunches every morning before work, life changes so strangely. One day, you're labeling juice boxes for your child. 40 years later, you're whispering to an attorney about your husband sleeping with that child's wife. Before hanging up, Margaret spoke very calmly. "Naomi, listen carefully to me." I tightened my grip on the phone. "Do not confront them yet. I wasn't planning to. Good. And do not reveal emotional reactions if possible." That almost made me laugh softly. Too late for that advice. My entire generation of women was raised to survive pain silently. People become unpredictable once they realize consequences are coming, Margaret continued, especially when finances and reputation are involved. Reputation. There it was. The thing Richard valued almost as much as control. "I'd like you to gather copies of all financial records you can access," she said. Quietly. Everything important now seemed to require silence. After we ended the call, I remained sitting in darkness for a very long time, listening to the refrigerator hum softly nearby. Outside, rain continued falling across Evanston. Steady, cold, endless. And somewhere upstairs, my husband slept peacefully, believing he still controlled the story of our marriage. But what Richard still didn't understand was this. The moment Daniel asked that question at the front door. The affair stopped being sustainable. Secrets survive only while innocent people remain blind. And my son had finally started opening his eyes. The next morning, Richard left the house before sunrise. No goodbye kiss, no coffee together, just the sound of his car backing out of the driveway. While darkness still covered the street outside, I stood at the kitchen window, watching the taillights disappear through the rain. For years, mornings with Richard followed the same rhythm. Coffee, newspaper, quiet conversation before work. Marriage is built from ordinary rituals, more than grand romantic moments. And once those rituals disappear, love often vanishes, long before people admit it aloud. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting in Margaret Holloway's office downtown. The building smelled faintly like old paper and polished wood. Margaret herself looked exactly how I imagined a woman surviving 40 years in family law would look. Sharp eyes, perfect posture, no patience for nonsense. She reviewed the financial folders I brought without interrupting, while I sat across from her, twisting my wedding ring nervously. Finally, she removed her reading glasses slowly. "How long have you suspected the affair?" 2 weeks, I answered quietly. "But I only confirmed it recently." Margaret nodded once. "And your husband doesn't know you know?" "No." "Good." Again, that word, good. I was beginning to understand something uncomfortable. In situations like this, emotional reactions help the guilty people more than the injured ones. Margaret organized several papers neatly into separate folders. "Naomi, your husband has been restructuring assets quietly for months. Months. Not impulsive behavior, planning." That realization still hurt every time I heard it aloud. He transferred portions of investment accounts into joint holding structures connected to secondary partnerships. I frowned slightly. "I don't understand what that means." "It means," Margaret said calmly, "Richard has been preparing financially for divorce much longer than you realized." The room suddenly felt colder. I stared down at the paperwork spread across her desk. Every number represented years of my life. Night shifts, sacrifices, canceled vacations. I remembered clipping coupons while Richard built his accounting firm from a tiny office above a pharmacy in Milwaukee. I typed invoices beside him at night, while Daniel slept in a portable crib near the filing cabinets. Back then, every dollar felt shared, earned together. Now, I was looking at documents, proving my husband quietly prepared to protect himself from me. While sleeping with my son's wife, human beings can become unrecognizable slowly. Margaret slid another folder toward me. "These property evaluations concern me most." I opened the folder carefully. House estimates, retirement projections, asset division models. My chest tightened immediately. Richard wasn't only planning divorce, he was planning my removal. "He wants to force the sale of the house," I whispered. Margaret nodded. Most likely." Most likely. Such calm words for something so devastating. That house contained my entire adult life. Daniel's first steps happened in the living room. Walter proposed to his wife Claire in our backyard during a 4th of July barbecue. Every Christmas morning for 42 years began beside that fireplace, and somewhere during secret conversations with Ember. Richard apparently decided I no longer belonged there. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Naomi, I need to ask something difficult." I looked up. "Do you believe the relationship between Richard and your daughter-in-law could influence financial decisions involving your son?" The question settled heavily between us. "Yes," I answered softly. "Because now, I understood the real danger. This affair wasn't only emotional betrayal anymore. It was becoming strategic, financial, potentially destructive to Daniel, in ways he still couldn't imagine." When I left Margaret's office, 2 hours later, rain still covered downtown Chicago. I sat inside my car for several minutes gripping the steering wheel, while people hurried past sidewalks, holding umbrellas and coffee cups. Normal life continuing around me. Funny how personal disasters remain invisible to strangers. My phone buzzed suddenly.
Daniel.
For one terrifying second, I wondered if he had discovered everything already. Hi, sweetheart. His voice sounded strained. Mom, are you busy? No. A pause. Then, can we meet somewhere? Something inside my chest tightened immediately. Of course. We met at a small diner near Northwestern University around lunchtime. Daniel already sat in a booth near the windows when I arrived. He looked exhausted, darker circles beneath his eyes, shirt wrinkled, coffee untouched in front of him. The moment I sat down, I knew he hadn't slept. You okay? I asked gently. He laughed softly, not happily. I don't know anymore. The waitress approached, but Daniel barely noticed her. His hands remained wrapped tightly around the coffee mug, even after she walked away. Finally, he looked directly at me. Mom, can I ask you something honestly? Every nerve in my body went still. Yes. Daniel swallowed hard. Do you think Dad's unhappy? The question nearly broke my heart, because beneath it sat the real fear he wasn't ready to say aloud yet. Not unhappy. Gone. I chose my words carefully. I think your father's confused about himself lately. Daniel stared down at the table. That's what Ember keeps saying. Again. Ember controlling the explanation. Directing emotional traffic inside the family, while secretly causing the damage herself. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face tiredly. I feel like I'm losing my mind. No, sweetheart. His eyes lifted toward mine. Something's wrong, he whispered. There it was. The instinct becoming impossible for him to ignore now. I walk into rooms and conversations stop. His voice cracked slightly. Dad acts weird around Ember. Ember acts weird around Dad. And every time I notice it, they make me feel paranoid. Gaslighting. That ugly, modern word women my age didn't grow up using, but understood intimately anyway. Make someone question their own reality long enough. And eventually they stop trusting themselves entirely. I reached across the table and touched Daniel's hand gently. You're not crazy, the second I said it. Tears filled his eyes instantly. Not dramatic tears, exhausted ones. Like someone silently carrying confusion too heavy for too long. I don't know what to do, he admitted quietly. God, my poor son. Sitting there terrified something terrible was happening, while still unable to imagine the truth itself. And suddenly, I realized something devastating. The affair was no longer hidden because Richard and Ember were careful. It remained hidden because Daniel's love for them made the truth emotionally impossible for him to fully see, but not for much longer. Because once people begin questioning reality, answers eventually follow. And deep down, I think all three of us knew our family was approaching the point where everything would finally explode. After lunch with Daniel, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes, unable to start the engine. Rainwater slid slowly down the windshield, while students crossed the streets around Northwestern carrying backpacks and coffee cups, laughing about ordinary problems that still belonged to ordinary lives. And suddenly, I envied them, not their youth, their certainty, the simple comfort of believing the people who loved them were actually safe. My phone buzzed once beside me. A message from Richard. Running late tonight. Don't wait for dinner. Short, cold, practical. I stared at the message for a long moment. Once upon a time, Richard used to call me during business trips just to describe sunsets from hotel windows. Because he said beautiful things felt incomplete if I didn't see them too. Now, I received logistical updates like an office assistant. Funny how emotional abandonment begins, long before physical departure. That evening, I ate alone in the kitchen. Tomato soup. Half a sandwich. The television murmured softly in the living room, though I barely listened. Every sound inside the house felt temporary now, as if the life I built there was already quietly being packed into invisible boxes. Around 9 o'clock, Richard finally came home. I heard his keys hit the counter before he walked into the kitchen, loosening his tie. "You're still awake." I couldn't sleep. He nodded absently while opening the refrigerator. No kiss, no warmth, just movement, routine. Then suddenly, he glanced toward me. "Did you do something different with your hair?" The question startled me, because it was the first personal thing he'd noticed about me in weeks. "No." He grabbed water and leaned against the counter. For one strange second, he almost looked nervous. Then he asked quietly, "Did Daniel say anything to you today?" There it was, the real reason for the conversation. Not my hair, not concern, information gathering. I kept my expression calm. We had lunch. Richard's posture tightened slightly. "How is he?" "Interesting." He didn't ask what we discussed, only whether Daniel suspected anything yet. "Tired," I answered carefully. Richard looked away immediately. Guilt again. Subtle, but growing heavier around him now. "He's under pressure," Richard muttered. I studied him quietly across the kitchen. This man was helping create the very pain he described. And somehow, he still spoke like an outside observer. "How long have you been unhappy?" I asked softly. The question landed heavily between us. Richard froze completely. Not dramatically, just still. Then slowly, he set down the water bottle. "Where is this coming from?" I held his gaze calmly. "You haven't looked at me the same way in a very long time." Something flickered across his face then. Not love, not even remorse. Recognition. Like, he suddenly realized I was no longer sleepwalking through our marriage beside him. Richard rubbed one hand across his jaw tiredly. "Naomi?" My name sounded almost fragile in his voice. But fragile things can still destroy people. "I think we both know things have changed," he admitted carefully. There it was. The beginning, not truth, but preparation for truth. People easing themselves toward confession rarely start with honesty. They start with emotional distancing. I nodded once. Yes. Silence filled the kitchen. Then Richard spoke again. "I never wanted to hurt you." That sentence nearly made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because people say it while actively destroying your life. "I know," I replied quietly. And strangely, I think that unsettled him more than anger would have. The next morning, I met Margaret again. This time she reviewed copies of account records. Richard didn't realize I still has access to. Retirement funds, investment portfolios, property holdings. The deeper we looked, the uglier things became. Margaret removed her glasses slowly. "Naomi, your husband moved a significant amount of money 6 months ago." My stomach tightened immediately. "How much?" Enough to matter in court." I stared down at the documents spread across her desk. 6 months. Around the same time, the messages between Richard and Ember became more intimate. Not coincidence. Planning. Margaret's voice remained calm. I also noticed transfers connected to Daniel's business accounts. That made my entire body go cold. "What?" She slid another paper toward me. Small withdrawals, repeated consulting payments, authorized electronically, to a private account linked to Ember. I felt physically sick. "She's taking money from Daniel, too." Margaret nodded slowly, possibly without full disclosure. God. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm. This wasn't passion anymore. This was greed, manipulation. A woman quietly feeding off both father and son simultaneously. I pressed trembling fingers against my temple. Daniel had trusted her completely, built a life with her, defended her, and all this time, she was draining him financially while sleeping with his father. Human cruelty has layers you never imagine, until you witness them personally. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "You need to decide something, Naomi." I looked up slowly. "Whether your priority is protecting yourself or protecting your son too." The question haunted me all afternoon, because the truth was awful. If this exploded publicly, Daniel would collapse emotionally. But if I stayed silent longer, Richard and Ember would continue tightening financial control around him. By evening, I finally made a decision. Not emotional, not impulsive, clear. I drove directly to Daniel's house after sunset. His car already sat in the driveway. Lights glowed warmly through the windows. For several seconds, I remained seated inside my car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Then I walked to the front door and knocked. Daniel opened it almost immediately. Relief crossed his face when he saw me. "Mom!" I stepped inside quietly. The house smelled faintly like coffee and laundry detergent. Normal life again. Normal life. Hiding disaster underneath it. "Is Ember home?" I asked. Daniel frowned slightly. "She's out with friends." "Friends." I nodded slowly. Then I looked directly at my son. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I chose honesty over protection. "Daniel," I said softly, "we need to talk about your father and Ember." And instantly, the color drained from his face. Daniel stared at me for several long seconds, without speaking. And the warmth disappeared from his face so quickly. It frightened me. Behind him, soft jazz music still played quietly from a speaker near the kitchen. A coffee mug sat half-finished beside the couch. The television glowed silently in the corner. Normal evening, normal house, normal life, seconds before destruction. "What about them?" he asked carefully. I closed the front door behind me. My hands felt strangely calm now, not because I wasn't terrified, because once truth begins moving, fear no longer changes anything. "Sit down, sweetheart." Daniel didn't move immediately. His eyes searched my face desperately, as if hoping he already misunderstood. "Mom, what's going on?" God. Hearing fear in your child's voice never becomes easier, no matter how old they get. Finally, he sat slowly on the couch while I remained standing near the fireplace. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I said the sentence that shattered what remained of our family. "I believe your father and Ember are having an affair." Daniel blinked once, just once, like his brain physically refused to process the words. Then he laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because shock sometimes sounds like disbelief, before it sounds like pain. "What?" I swallowed carefully. I didn't want to believe it either. "No." Daniel shook his head immediately. "No, that's impossible." I said nothing, because denial needs silence sometimes. He stood abruptly and began pacing across the living room. "This is insane." Tears burned behind my eyes, watching him unravel in real time. I remembered this same boy at 8 years old crying because another child stole his lunchbox at school. Daniel always loved people completely, and that was the tragedy. People who love honestly never imagine betrayal this ugly, until it destroys them personally. "Mom," he stopped, pacing suddenly. "Why would you even think this?" I reached slowly into my purse and removed my phone. Then carefully, gently, I placed it on the coffee table between us. The screenshot sat there silently. Messages, hotel confirmations, photographs, proof. Daniel stared down at them without touching the phone. His entire body had gone still. "No," he whispered. I looked away. "Because watching your child discover betrayal feels unbearable, even when you didn't cause it." Finally, Daniel picked up the phone with trembling hands. The room remained completely silent, except for his uneven breathing while he scrolled, and each message destroyed him, piece by piece. I watched it happen physically across his face. Confusion, shock, disbelief. Then finally, pain so deep it almost looked childlike. "Oh my God." His voice cracked completely. He sat down heavily on the couch, staring at the screen like it might somehow rearrange itself into another reality. "She." His throat tightened visibly. "She called him baby." I closed my eyes briefly. Yes, there were dozens of messages worse than that. But betrayal becomes real through tiny, intimate details. Pet names, private jokes, emotional familiarity. That's what destroys people. Daniel suddenly stood again so violently. The coffee table shook. How long? Almost a year. And the second those words left my mouth, something inside him collapsed entirely. He pressed both hands against his face. A broken sound escaped his chest. Not anger, grief, raw, immediate. My God! I moved toward him instinctively. He stepped back. Not from me, from the truth itself. Then suddenly, rage arrived, violent, fast. Sel, Daniel, grabbed the whiskey bottle from the kitchen counter and hurled it across the room. Glass exploded against the wall beside the fireplace. The sound made both of us jump. I trusted them, he shouted. Years of heartbreak filled that sentence. Not just marriage heartbreak, family heartbreak. The worst kind. They sat at my table, he whispered hoarsely. They looked me in the face every day. Tears finally rolled down his cheeks, openly now. I had not seen my son cry since Walter's funeral. I know, I whispered. No, you don't. Daniel shook uncontrollably. You don't know what this feels like. He was wrong, I knew exactly. And that was the terrible part. For several minutes, he simply paced the room, breathing unevenly, while rain struck the windows outside. Finally, he stopped moving. Then came the question I dreaded most. Does Dad know you know? Yes. Daniel stared at me in shock. And he still came here? Still sat at this table, pretending nothing was wrong? I nodded once slowly. And the hatred that crossed my son's face then frightened me. Not because Daniel was violent, because betrayal had finally replaced love inside him. I'm going to kill him, he whispered. You're not. He destroyed my marriage. And if you confront them tonight, they'll destroy you financially too. That stopped him. Slowly, Daniel looked toward me again. What do you mean? I told him everything then. The money transfers, the divorce planning, the house discussions, the hidden accounts. Each revelation hollowed him out further. By the time I finished speaking, Daniel looked physically ill. She used me, he whispered finally. I sat beside him carefully. She used all of us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel suddenly laughed bitterly through tears. You know what's crazy? I waited quietly. I kept thinking something was wrong with me. He stared down at his shaking hands. I thought I was becoming paranoid. Gaslighting destroys trust in yourself before it destroys trust in others. That's why it works so well. You were noticing reality, I said softly. Daniel wiped his face roughly. What do we do now? We, interesting word. Not what do I do. What do we do? Because at some point during that conversation, mother and son stopped being separate victims. Now, we were survivors standing on the same side of the wreckage. I looked toward the rain-covered windows, then back at my son. We stay calm. Daniel laughed again harshly. How? Because emotional people make mistakes. That sentence sounded strange coming from me, but suddenly, I understood why older women survive things. Younger women often can't. Life teaches you how to keep functioning while your heart breaks. Daniel leaned back slowly against the couch. His eyes looked empty now, exhausted, changed. Then, quietly, almost like a child again, he asked, did they ever love us at all? And somehow, that question shattered me more than the affair itself ever could. Daniel stayed at my house that night. Not because he wanted comfort, because he couldn't bear returning to the same bed Ember had shared with him, while secretly sleeping with his father. Some betrayals contaminate physical spaces, sheets, hallways, kitchen tables. Even breathing inside certain rooms starts feeling unbearable afterward. He slept in the guest room downstairs where Walter used to stay during winter visits before he passed away. Or at least, he tried to sleep. Around 3 a.m, I found Daniel sitting alone on the back patio, wrapped in one of my old blankets, staring into darkness. Rain still lingered softly across the yard. "You should come inside," I said gently. He shook his head without looking at me. "I keep replaying everything." I sat beside him quietly. That's the difficult thing about discovering betrayal. Your memories don't disappear. They reorganize themselves painfully. Every anniversary suddenly feels fake. Every smile suspicious. Every happy moment contaminated by questions. "How did I miss it?" Daniel whispered hoarsely. I wrapped the blanket tighter around his shoulders. "Because you loved them." He laughed bitterly. "No, because I was stupid." I turned toward him immediately. "Don't do that to yourself." "But it's true." "It isn't." Daniel finally looked at me then. His eyes were swollen from crying. Exhausted. In a way I had never seen before. "Good people trust naturally," I said softly. "Cruel people depend on that." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel lowered his head into his hands. "I loved her so much, Mom. God, hearing heartbreak in your child's voice never stops hurting, no matter how old they become." I remembered Daniel at 25 introducing Ember to us, for the first time at a 4th of July barbecue. She wore a yellow sundress and laughed easily with everyone. Richard liked her immediately. Too immediately. I realize now. At the time, I thought they simply shared strong personalities. Funny how hindsight quietly rewrites entire histories. "What happens now?" Daniel asked eventually. I stared out at the dark backyard where Richard once built Daniel a treehouse, by hand one summer. The same hands later touched his son's wife. Human beings contain contradictions ugly enough to ruin entire families. "Now," I said carefully, "we stop protecting people who never protected us." The next morning, Daniel contacted an attorney recommended by Margaret. By noon, he had frozen all shared business accounts connected to Ember. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw fear enter someone else's eyes instead of ours. Ember arrived at my house just after 4 o'clock that afternoon. She looked beautiful. Perfect hair. Cream-colored coat. Diamond earrings Daniel bought for her anniversary last year. Amazing how polished people can look, while their lives collapse underneath them. The moment I opened the front door, she knew. Women always know. "Where's Daniel?" she asked carefully. I stepped aside silently. She entered the living room slowly, and froze when she saw him sitting there beside Margaret Holloway. Richard stood near the fireplace looking pale enough to collapse. Good. For once, let them feel uncomfortable. No one invited Ember to sit down. That rattled her immediately. What's going on? Daniel looked at her for a very long time before speaking. The grief in his face had hardened overnight into something colder. "You tell me." Ember's eyes flickered briefly toward Richard. Tiny movement, but devastating, because now Daniel saw it too. The instinctive connection between them. The secret language. The panic. "I don't understand," she whispered. Liar. Even her confusion sounded rehearsed. Daniel reached calmly toward the coffee table and slid printed screenshots across the surface. The messages. Hotel reservations. Photos. Proof. Ember stared at them silently. Then finally, she looked toward Richard again. Not her husband. Richard. That was all Daniel needed. The sound he made afterward barely sounded human. Not yelling. Not rage. Something worse. A person realizing his entire life had been built beside people, capable of destroying him without remorse. "How long?" he whispered. Neither of them answered immediately. Cowards often become silent, once truth removes their performance. Finally, Richard spoke quietly. "Daniel?" "No," my son stood abruptly. "You do not get to say my name right now." I had never heard Daniel speak to his father that way before. Richard looked suddenly older, standing there. Smaller, too. Funny how power disappears. Once deception loses control of the room. Ember began crying then. Soft tears. Careful tears. But nobody moved to comfort her. Because some grief is self-inflicted. I never meant for this to happen, she whispered. Daniel laughed bitterly. That's what makes this even worse. Silence filled the room heavily afterward. 42 years of marriage, a son, a family, destroyed inside one living room. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Margaret eventually handled the legal conversation. After that, divorce filings, financial disclosures, separate representation, practical words for emotional destruction. I barely listened. Instead, I watched Richard quietly. For the first time since this began, he looked directly at me without pretending. No charm, no excuses, just shame. You knew, he said softly. I nodded once. For weeks. His face tightened painfully. You should have confronted me. I almost smiled hearing that. Interesting how dishonest people suddenly crave honesty once they lose control. No, I replied calmly. You should have respected me enough not to betray me in the first place. Richard looked down immediately, and strangely, that moment brought me peace. Not revenge, not satisfaction, closure, because after months of confusion, I finally understood something clearly. Their betrayal said nothing about my worth, only theirs. A month later, Daniel moved into a condominium downtown while the divorce proceedings began. Richard rented an apartment alone near Oak Park. Ember disappeared from all our lives almost overnight. People built on manipulation rarely survive, once truth removes their advantages. As for me, I stayed in the house they planned to take from me, every Sunday morning. I drink coffee beside the kitchen window watching sunlight move across the backyard. Walter once filled with tree houses and rose bushes. Some days still hurt. Grief doesn't disappear, just because truth arrives. But peace returned slowly, after the lies left. Last week, Daniel visited for dinner. We made pasta together, while old jazz records played softly through the kitchen again. At one point, he looked at me and said quietly, I think we're going to be okay. And for the first time in a very long time, I believed it too.